Hello everyone. Today I'll be reading the Girl Crusoes. Last time, the Westmacott sisters packed up to go on a trip with their uncle on their ship. Let's see what happens now. Chapter 4. Aboard the Elizabeth. Here we are, cried Captain Barton as the train ran into the dock station at Southampton. Now mind you don't get run over. The idea, said Tommy. We have been here before, Uncle. So you have, my dear. But good advice is none the worse for being said twice. They made their way across the metals, on which locomotives were hauling and pushing heavy goods wagons, and came to the quay where the Elizabeth lay, taking in cargo. She looked a mere dwarf beside a castle liner not far away, but she was bright with the glory of new paint, and Captain Barton gazed at her with an affectionate pride that he would never have felt for a steamship. They went on board. Mr. Purvis, the Scots mate, gave the girls a shy greeting. They smiled at those of the crew whom they recognized, and a look of pained bewilderment settled on the face of one Sandy Sam, and Tommy asked him if he had any more big gooseberries. Never mention the word to him, said the captain anxiously as they went below. He's very sensitive, my dear. Ah, you're afraid of going to be found out. You know you are, replied Tommy. Oh, what a sweet little cabin. The captain had thrown open the door of the cabin, which he had prepared for his nieces next to the saloon. The girls looked in eagerly. Oh, very nice, said Elizabeth. I'm glad you like it, my dear, said the captain. I did my best, and Purvis was uncommon useful too. A woman couldn't have managed better, said Mary. Well, you see, bachelor men like me and Purvis get into the way of making up for what we lose. We nearly forgot the looking glass though, not having any particular features ourselves to be proud of. The cabin was very daintily got up. The woodwork was beautifully polished. There were 2 bunks on one side, one above the other, and a third on the opposite side, each with a spotless white bed cover. On one wall hung a looking glass, and a tiny wash-hand basin of polished zinc was fit into a little alcove. There were hooks for hanging clothes on the partition. The clear space between the sides was only 2 or 3 feet across. Where shall we put our trunk? Asked Elizabeth practically. In the saloon, my dear. We'll fasten it there, to prevent it rolling about we meet any rough weather. We shall have to get out one at a time, said Tommy with a laugh. There isn't room for 2 to do up their hair at once. Well, I know nothing about that, said the captain, rubbing his bald crown. You mustn't quarrel or fight about who shall be first, or I'll have to clap you in irons. Where do you keep your irons? Asked Tommy. Like to see the dreadful things. The captain looked so much embarrassed that Tommy divined the truth at once. Why, you haven't got any, she cried, dancing. What a naughty old fibber you are. Well, you see, I picked my crew. Them that aren't English are Scotch or Irish, and very respectable men. But I dare say we can get a set of irons in town. Come along, we'll go and get something to eat. We're too busy to cook on board. I'll just drop in at one of the marine stores and see if they got a small size of iron for obstreperous females. As they walked up the high street, Tommy suddenly cried, Look, Bess, isn't that little Dan Whiddon? I wondered why he wasn't at the station to wish us goodbye. She pointed up the street where she had seen a small, oddly dressed figure pass under the narrow ancient arch that divides the street into above and below bar. They hurried in that direction, but when they reached the spot, the figure had disappeared. I think you must have been mistaken, said Mary. Dan wouldn't come so far from home. I dare say. Now, uncle, where shall we go? I'm famished. The captain led them to the Crown Hotel. He confessed that if he had been alone, he would have gone to a humbler place near the docks, where he might meet some shipmates. But you girls wouldn't like to eat among half a dozen sea dogs smoking shag, he said. As they ate their luncheon, he said that he was disappointed with his cargo. He had hoped to have a full ship for the South American ports, but feared that after all he would have to go out light. Tommy's assurance that his passengers would make up did not appear to convince him. They slept on board that night and were very merry at the novel experience of undressing and dressing in such a narrow space. Early next morning, the ship was towed out into the harbour. She had hardly made a cable's length, however, when the captain received a message semaphore from the key to the effect that his agent had secured enough goods to accompany his freight. It would not be ready for shipment for 2 days. He did not think it worthwhile to put back into dock, as the extra cargo would be brought out in lighters. During the next 2 days, the girls were much amused to see their uncle in his little dinghy, which held 3 other squeaks going to and fro between the ship and the shore, propelling himself by means of one oar fixed in a groove at the stern. Nothing would satisfy them until he allowed one of the sailors, usually Sonny Pat, to take them in turn and teach them how to work the little tub in this manner. Finding it very easy, Tommy begged the captain to let her take him ashore, and was delighted when he told her on landing that she would make a skipper in no time. She immediately bought a huge sailor's knife, much to his amusement. The sisters, not to be outdone, in their turn rowed him ashore, and each also bought a knife. "You'll be terrible folk in a mutiny," said the captain, laughing. "I must really see about getting those irons." But when the vessel's hull was filled from the lighters and the cargo was complete, there were no irons among the equipment. The Elizabeth was towed down Southampton water. Then, the wind being fair, the courses were set, and she was soon sailing merrily down channel. The girls were in the highest spirits. It was a glorious day. The sea glistened in the sunlight, and as the vessel passed through the Solent, with the wooded shores of Hampshire on the right and the island on the left, the captain pointed out to his nieces various landmarks and interesting spots, and gave them a first lesson in navigation. In 3 or 4 hours they passed the Needles. "Now girls," said the captain, "my advice is keep fairly quiet for a while. There's a bit of swell, and well, I say no more." Elizabeth and Mary remained reclining in their deck chairs, quietly enjoying their novel experiences. But Tommy was as nimble as Ariel on the vessel the Duke of Milan. He was here, there, and everywhere, asking why this and what the other, now exclaiming at a warship that glided silently past, now watching a graceful white-sailed yacht, at one moment standing by the helmsman, then flashing along the deck to ask her uncle for an explanation of something that caught her attention. The captain watched her with kindly amusement. He did not repeat his warning. The lads had better get it over, he thought. Recently, his amusement became mixed with a little anxiety as he saw her growing quieter, a tinge of green coming to her complexion. At last, with a sudden cry of "Oh!" she rushed to the companion and disappeared. The other girls followed her anxiously, and for a time they were seen no more. Thanks to the steadiness of the ship and the comparative smoothness of the sea, their sufferings were neither violent nor prolonged. But it was a much subdued Tommy who emerged an hour or 2 later and meekly put her hand into her uncle's. The next moment she gave a gasp. Not a yard away, lying on the pile canvas, huddled a little figure in brown corduroy and something boots. It was Dan Whedon, pale, grimy, with tear-stained eyes, fast asleep. "There's a young Samson for you," said the captain, noticing Tommy's look of amazement. "A young rascal stowaway. Long Jimmy heard a tap in the forehold a while ago, and when the men opened up, a nuisance when all the cargo was naturally stowed. There was this young reprobate, half dead with hunger and fright. You were due to answer for, Tommy." "Why? What have you done?" asked the girl. "Well, you and your sister seem to have spoiled the young scamp. When they brought him up from below, he whimpered out that the young ladies had been kind to him, and he didn't like carrying luggage and cleaning railway lamps. And when he heard that you were coming to sea, he wanted his mother to get me to take him as a cabin boy. She boxed his ears. But he found out when you were leaving, and hid in a goods wagon that reached Southampton little before we did, and watched his opportunity to slip on board when the bark was lying at the quayside. That's all I got out of him." And the motion served him as his sermost lantern, and he dropped asleep just where you see him there. I'll have something to say to him when he wakes. "Poor little fellow," said Tommy. "You won't be hard on him, uncle?" The captain grunted. Perhaps he remembered that 50 years before he had himself run away to sea. "The rascally young stowaway," he muttered. "I can't put him ashore, as I shan't touch at any port this side of Buenos Aires. And his mother crying her eyes out, I'll be bound. And I'll have to send several shillings on cable to tell her he's safe. A pretty thing for a man with 3 meters. I'll pay for the cable, uncle." "What? Has she damaged the cable?" asked Mary innocently, coming up at this moment. Captain Barton shook with laughter, "Oh, you bookworm," he said when he had come under his breath. "Take a load of Cable Mary and see you think Tommy, for all her mischievousness, could do it much damage. No, 'tis another kind of cable we were speaking of. All along your young Samson there. What would you do with Starway best?" he asked of his eldest niece, who had just joined the others. "Good gracious!" exclaimed Elizabeth. "You are right after all, Tommy. What a little sweet he looks." At this moment, Jack stirred, opened his eyes, and when he saw the girl, smiled sheepishly. "Now, young Samson, stand out and listen to me," said the captain severely. "Lay a hold on that stay. There, if you can't stand steady, you come sneaking aboard this vessel, ruining my cargo, expecting to fill yourself with my victuals, and all for what? Because you didn't like cleaning lamps and carrying luggage. What's that for a reason? There's worse than that aboard ship, I can tell you. If I did my duty, I should have you lashed to the mast and dosed with a cat, and your poor mother crying her eyes out, and the police dragging the punts, and the government sending detectives to all parts, and wiring to all recruiting sergeants, spending hundreds of pounds of country's money all for discontented young shaver not 4 feet high. Now just you run along to Mr. Purvis and ask him to forgive you. He's very strict, is Mr. Purvis, much stricter than I am. They asked Sandy Sam very politely to fling a few buckets of water over you and squirt you a holy stone. And after that go to cook and ask him he can spare a biscuit and a can of soup. And then I'll see I can find some clothes that will fit you, and we'll make a man out of you and an AED in time." The captain's tone grew less stern and more genial as he went along, and when he had finished, Dan smiled cheerfully, gave Tommy an extra smile, and went aft to obey orders. The run down channel was very pleasant to the girls. They showed the keenest interest in the ship and the doings of the sailors. These rough, good-tempered fellows were flattered by the attentions of their passengers, and never tired of answering their questions. It was not long before all three were able to tie all kinds of sailors' knots, splice ropes, and do other simple things of the kind. They knew the names of the sails and the yards, and Tommy in particular never tired of airing her nautical vocabulary. Even the ship's cook became their willing slave. Elizabeth took him in hand, and he meekly received her instructions with great advantage to his bill of fare. Captain Barton declared it was a good job he was retiring, for this unwanted luxury was killing his seaman's qualities. The evenings were spent in the little deck cabin, where they played at draughts with the captain and mate, or listened to the yarns they spun. Mary had brought her mandolin, and on fine evenings they would get up a concert, the sailors singing their chanties and dancing the hornpipe. The captain hunted out some ancient grass hammock, and the weather was quite calm. The sailors rigged these up on the deck for the girls. Some of the crew taught them how to make hammocks using strings instead of grass, and they often amused themselves by weaving string bags and baskets. As for Dan Ridden, he soon became the pet of the ship. He was a good-tempered little fellow, willing to oblige anybody. He was kept always busy, and he was not long before he found that the life of a sailor was a good deal harder than even that of porters or wayside stations. "What I likes it I do," he said once to Tommy. "They're in cleaning lamps and shops." "You get no tips, Dan," she replied. "What's tips? I never had no good of them, miss. Mother took them all except a penny now and then for sweets. And the captain he gives me sweets for nothing either, so I save, don't I, miss?" The weather held fair almost without interruption, and the girls became so well seasoned that an occasional gale did not distress them. As they approached the tropics, the heat became rather trying, and then they brought out their trunks sundry light blouses, at which their uncle cocked an eye. "Frank disobedient," he said sternly. "I said search." "Don't they look nice, uncle?" said Tommy mischievously. "And we made them ourselves. You can't object to that, my dear man. And we shall wash them ourselves, so there's no laundry bill for you to pay. In fact, you haven't a leg to stand on, so you'd better say that once they look sweet and save time, don't you think so, Mr. Purvis?" "Well," said the Scotsman cautiously, "I wouldn't say about what they are suitable to the climate, but a terrible gay life. Oh, you should see Beth's evening frock. It's perfectly lovely, chiffon with pink insertion. It shows her dark hair splendidly." "There, Tommy, that will do," said the captain. "Such frock isn't suitable aboard this vessel. You're unruly mixes, and what I'll do in London, I don't know. Just stay and get used to it, uncle dear, and I really wouldn't worry I were you. We'll keep you straight." "The happy girl, Purvis," said the captain when they were alone. "Oh, aye, is that." They spent a couple of days in Buenos Aires while Captain Barton was unloading part of his cargo and settling his affairs. When they left, a certain young electrical engineer asked to be allowed to call on them when he returned to England, and looked very crestfallen when Elizabeth told him that they had no address. They were almost disappointed when they rounded the terrible Cape Horn without encountering a storm. After a short stay at Valparaiso, the captain set his course direct for the Pacific Islands. Interested as the girls had been hitherto, they became intensely excited now. Mary knew a great deal about Captain Cook and other early navigators, and all the girls had read a volume of Stevenson's on the South Seas, which their uncle had brought home once in a colonial edition. The romance of this quarter of the globe had captured their imagination, and they looked eagerly forward to seeing the strange men and women, the gorgeous scenery, the many novel things which their reading and their uncle's stories had led them to expect. Chapter 5. A Midnight Wreck. "Well now, I'm real glad I brought you girls with me," said Captain Barton as they sat on deck one evening. "Many's the time I felt a bit lonesome at night between sunset and turning in. But you do help to pass the time away." "Pastimes, are we?" said Tommy with affected indignation. "Boys, dogs! I won't be called a dog!" "Very well, my dear, you shan't," replied her uncle, slipping one arm around her waist and the other round Mary's. Elizabeth sat on her deck chair opposite them, knitting at the second of a pair of socks. "But now," continued the captain, "you better be turning in. It's latish, and sleep, you know, is a precious thing. Below from pole to pole, and you don't get your full 8 hours, you'll be neither useful nor ornamental, Miss Tommy." "Oh, Uncle, it's such a lovely night," pleaded Tommy, leaning back on his arm and looking up into the brilliant sky, a sky such as is seen in the South Pacific and nowhere else in the world. Here, a heavy figure approached the group from forward. "Glass is dropping fast, sir," said Mr. Purvis, Elizabeth's needles piece clicking. "That means a storm, doesn't it, Uncle?" she said. "Bit of a blow, maybe," said the captain. "Now, girls, off with you. I'll just make things snug. You go below and sleep through it, and you'll come up fresh as paint in the morning." Tommy grumbled a little, declaring that a storm was impossible in such a clear sky and no wind. But she went below with her sisters, and soon all three were fast asleep in their snug little cabin. It was perhaps 2 hours later when Elizabeth awoke suddenly. There were strange noises overhead, and the ship was rolling and pitching with a violence new to her. Every now and then she heard a hoarse shout and the scurry of feet on deck. The little appointments of the cabin rattled, and presently, as the vessel gave a particularly heavy lurch, the glass water bottle slipped from its rack and fell with a crash to the floor. "What is it?" cried Tommy, sitting straight up in her bunk. "The sea is rather rough," said Elizabeth quietly, "and has sent the water bottle spinning." "It woke me with a start," said Tommy. "My heart is thumping like anything. Is there any danger?" "Now with Uncle on board," said Mary from the bunk below. "Let's go to sleep again." They lay down, but to sleep was impossible. Every moment the movements of the vessel became more violent, and they heard great booming noises as the wave broke over the deck. The roar and the shriek of the wind was mingled with the creaking of blocks and the shouts of men. "I can't stand it any longer," said Tommy suddenly. "I'm going up to sea. Come along, girls." She sprang out of her bunk and had to clutch her side to prevent herself from being thrown down. The other girls followed her, and she laughed as they staggered and clasped each other. "What fun!" she said. "We haven't had a real storm before. See who'll be dressed first. You two needn't do all your hair." Dressing was a difficult matter, but helping one another, they managed to get their things on at last, and holding hands, staggered out of the cabin to a companionway between it and the saloon. Tommy was the first to climb the ladder, but when she came to the top, she gave a cry of dismay. "The hatch is on!" she called. "Uncle has battered us down, mean old thing!" She beat on the hatch with her fist and called shrilly for her uncle, but the sounds were smothered by the greater noises above, and by she desisted, and tottered disconsolately down the steps. "Let's go into the saloon," she said. "There's more room there than in the cabin. You don't think there's any danger?" she added, as the light of the swinging lamp fell on Elizabeth's pale face. "I don't know. I hope not," replied Elizabeth. "It's a shame to batten us down," said Tommy indignantly. I'd rather be on deck and know the worst. The three girls went into the saloon and sat huddled together on the sofa, which was fixed firmly to the wall. They found that only by keeping a tight grip on the sofa and each other could they save themselves from being dashed across the room. Moment by moment, the storm increased in fury. Now and again there was a tremendous shock, under which the Elizabeth quivered in every plank, and sometimes a sharp report as of woodwork wrenched away. The girls were now thoroughly scared. Pressed close together, they shivered as they heard these ominous noises. None of them spoke, but Tommy gave a little gasp whenever a more than unusually heavy sea struck the vessel, and Mary gulped down a lump that would keep rising in her throat. Hours passed. Presently the movements of the vessel became less violent, and at last Tommy gave a cry of delight as she heard the battens being struck away from the hatch, and her uncle's voice as he descended the ladder. "Ah, there you are, my dears," he said cheerily as he entered the saloon. "I guess these little temperatures would have wakened you." "Is the storm over, Uncle?" asked Elizabeth. "Pretty near. He's giving a last kick or two. We're very tired and hungry on deck, and you girls can make us some coffee. I know you'd like to make yourselves useful. Food can be spared this minute or I wouldn't ask you." "Of course we will," said Tommy, springing up. "Is there much damage, Uncle?" asked Mary. "Damage? Why, bless you, you can't fight without getting bruises too, even you win. The crust had a bit of knocking about, I won't deny, but what could you expect? Now make the coffee, there's good lassies, and knock at the hatch when it's ready." "You're not going to batten us down again?" cried Tommy. "Well, you'll see, we don't want everything slop about below, do we? The coffee wouldn't be worth drinking if a sea washed into it just as you were bringing it up. Make it strong, mind, and plenty of sugar." Captain Biden left them. He had not thought it necessary to say that the cook, who couldn't be spared to make the coffee, was working hard at the pumps, nor that the vessel had lost its foremast, which in its fall had carried away the boats on the leeward side. While the ship was staggering under this blow, a heavy sea had struck her and stove in the boats on the weather side. Nor did the captain mention that the storm had driven him many leagues out of his course, and he was desperately anxious lest he should have come within region of coral reefs. Until daybreak, he had no means of ascertaining his whereabouts, and he concealed from his nieces the anxiety with which he awaited the dawn. He had paid his brief visit below merely to reassure the girls. They at once set about making a coffee, no easy task, for though the wind had abated, there was still a heavy sea. At last it was ready, and Tommy mounted the companionway carrying a canful. It was some time before her hammering on the hatch attracted attention, and when it was lifted, the can was taken from her by her uncle, who said, "Thanky, lass. Now go down again and have some breakfast. It'll be light in an hour or two." "Can we come up, Uncle?" "Not yet, my dear. We must tidy up first, you know." "Can't we help?" persisted Tommy. But there was no answer. Captain Barton had clapped on the hatch. "Poor little lassies," he said to himself. The girls drank some coffee and ate some biscuits, waiting impatiently for their release. It was no longer difficult to keep their seats. The howling of the wind had ceased, and the noise above gradually diminished, and the vessel steadied. But now they were conscious of a sound that they had not heard before. It was like the clanking of a steam engine. "I wonder what it is," cried Tommy, springing up. "Oh, I do so wish Uncle would let us go up. There's no danger now, surely." But the captain still remained above. The clanking sound continued, and slight noises were heard occasionally. The weather became still calmer, and the girls, when they had finished their simple breakfast, began to doze. Never since they left Southampton had their sleep been broken, and they would have returned to their bunks had it not been so near morning. So they cuddled up together on the sofa, Elizabeth in the middle, and the other girls with their arms around her. All at once there was a sudden jolt that set the tin cups flying from the table, and made the girls spring up in alarm. They were aware of a strange, rasping, scraping sound, clutching one another, their startled faces, and a mute question, to which, inexperienced as they were, their instincts supplied a clear answer. The ship had struck. There were loud shouts from above, a renewal of the scurrying on deck, then silence. A minute or two after the girls had heard the hatch removed, and their uncle hurried down. Even in the dim light of the smoky oil lamp, they saw how pale and haggard he looked. They were too much frightened to speak. "Girls," he said quietly, Put on your Macintoshes and anything warm you have, and come on deck at once. Don't wait for anything else." He was gone. The very calmness of his tone, the absence of his wonted jocularity, struck them with a chill feeling of dread. Silently, with pale faces, the girls fetched wraps and Macintoshes from their cabin, and hurriedly mounted the companion. When they reached the wet and slippery deck, a terrible spectacle lay before them, in the light of the crescent moon, shining fitfully through the scudding out. The foremast had snapped off at the height of a man. The deck was strewn with broken spars and a litter of torn sails and shattered rigging. On the lee side, the davits were twisted and bent, and the boats had disappeared. On the weather side, the boats still swung on the ropes, but were so battered that it was impossible to hope that they were seaworthy. 3 or 4 men were losing the lashings that secured the little dinghy. Others were bringing up provisions from the cook's galley. The monotonous clank of the pumps told how the rest were engaged. Close to the dinghy stood little Dan Whiddon, the cabin boy, shivering with cold and fear. "Show a leg now," cried the captain to the men who were busy with the dinghy. He turned to the girls, who stood near the companion, huddled in speechless terror. "You must get into the dinghy, my dears," he said gravely. "We have struck a reef. You can scale her, keep her going gently, and look out for a passing ship. Don't be alarmed, the sea is smooth, you see. We'll make a raft and come after you as soon as we can. My poor old ship is done for." "Oh, we can't leave you, uncle," said Elizabeth, with quivering lips. "No, we won't," cried Tommy, springing forward and clasping his arm. "Now, my dear," said the captain with forced cheerfulness, "you promised to obey orders, you know. We can't save the ship. Water is pouring into her. The one chance to get you safely afloat while we make a raft. You must go, for my sake. There must be land hereabouts. You'll see it when the sun gets up. And I lay you won't be ashore an hour before we join you. Come along now. All's ready." The captain's firmness showed that further remonstrance was in vain. He led them to the side where the dinghy had been lowered. Elizabeth was helped into it, and as she turned away, after embracing her uncle, she heard the first mate say, "Do you think there's room for young Dan, sir? He's no use to us." The captain hesitated for a moment. 3 was a full complement for a little boat, and even the boy's light extra weight might be a source of danger. Mary, as she kissed her uncle, heard the boatswain growl, "You may as well drown the lot. The dinghy can't take more than 3, no how." Then Tommy flung herself into her uncle's arm and sobbed a goodbye. "Now, my little lad," said he, "bear up, brace a word. There's one aboard who will look after you. Goodbye? Nonsense, I'll see you soon, never fear. Now, steady, there you go. Now, where's that boy?" But Dan Whiddon, hearing the pessimistic boatswain's words, had slipped away into the darkness. The captain called him, but he did not reappear. "Well, perhaps it's as well," said the captain. "Now, girls, don't tire yourselves out. Lay by till daylight. God bless you." Elizabeth silently took the sculls. The other 2 crouched in the bottom of the boat, which drew slowly away from the ill-fated ship. After a little, Tommy sprang up. "Stop rowing, Bess," she cried. "It's no use going on in the dark. Keep close to the ship so that we can see Uncle when he puts off on the raft." Elizabeth rested on her oars. There was reason in what Tommy had said. For a time, the girls could see the trembling masts of the ship in the moonlight, and dark figures moving about the deck. But presently, the moon was obscured. Some minutes passed before it again emerged from the clouds, and then, when the girls looked for the Elizabeth, there was not a trace of her to be seen. The 2 younger girls were now sitting up in the boat, facing their sister. They looked with wild eyes into the darkness. The same terrible thought oppressed them all. Had the bark gone down already? Had there been time for the construction of a raft? They dared not speak, lest their spoken fears should overwhelm them. Elizabeth skulked now in this direction, now in that, in the hope that it was merely distance that had removed the ship from sight. Now and again she rested on her oars and listened, but there was no sound in the breathless stillness, and she dipped her oars again. Inaction was unbearable, so the 3 miserable girls waited for dawn. It came at last with almost startling suddenness. At one moment all the sky was indigo with gleaming spots. The next, myriad spangles had disappeared, and the blue was covered with a curtain of grey. But daybreak did not bring with it the expected relief from suspense. A light mist hung upon the surface of the sea. a tantalizing filmy scream which the eye could not penetrate. The boat floated idly. Again the girls eagerly strained their ears for sounds of voices, or creaking tackle, or working oars, but they heard nothing except the slow rippling of the sea against the side of the dinghy. "Oh, Bess!" cried Tommy frantically. "We can't have come far. Row about, we must find the ship." Elizabeth, though hope was dead within her, rowed this way and that, but everywhere was an encircling mist. There was no sign of vessel, raft, or land. "We had better wait until the sun is up," she said at last. "It will scatter the mist, and then we can at least see our way." The air was growing warmer, with a damp, clammy heat, but the girls shivered as they sat silent in the gently rocking boat. The grey mist turned to a golden dust, and presently the sun burst through, putting the thinning vapor to flight. Now the girls eagerly scanned the horizon as it widened, but neither hull nor sail stood out of the immense tract of blue. Tommy rose in the boat to see if she could then descry any dark patch upon the surface which might be a raft, but there was nothing. Her lips quivered as the meaning of this vast blankness forced itself upon her mind. For a few moments she stood with her back to her sister. Then, turning suddenly, she said, with a laugh that was not very different from a sob, "There were 3 sailors of Bristol City. I say, how should I do for the part of little Billy?" This sudden touch of comedy relieved the tension, as Tommy intended. The other girls smiled feebly, and Tommy, saying to herself, "I must talk, or we shall all go mad," went on, "Could I have a swim, do you think?" She flung off her mackintosh. "It's getting hot." "Oh, you mustn't think of it," said Mary. "These waters are full of sharks." "Well then, let's have another breakfast. What have they given us?" While Elizabeth was examining the provisions placed in the boat, Tommy leaned over the side and dashed handfuls of water over her face. "There, now I feel better," she said. "What is there, Bess?" There were tins of biscuits, sardines, and condensed milk, a bottle of coffee extract, 3 tin cups, a spirit lamp, a small tin kettle, a tea caddy half full, a small box of sugar, a large plum cake, some boiled bacon, and 2-gallon jars containing water. "I am not hungry at present," said Elizabeth. "Neither am I, but one must do something," said Tommy. "A cup of water and a slice of cake for me." They all took a draught of water, but only Tommy made any pretense of eating. "Now, Bess," said Tommy as she gulped down her crumbs of cake, "we'll take turns to row. Uncle—" Her voice broke. She cleared her throat and continued. "Uncle said there must be land somewhere near, and he'll think us awful slackers if he gets there first." "We can't tell which way to go," said Mary. "Of course we can't, but we must choose a direction and stick to it, or we shall go round in a circle like dog chasing his tail. Of all the airs the wind can blow, I dearly love the west. Let's make for the west, and take our chance." This suggestion was adopted. Elizabeth admired her small sister's pluck in being so determinedly cheerful. They turned their faces to the sun, and for some time rowed steadily westward, each girl taking a spell at the oars. But as the day grew older, the heat became intolerable and exertion painful, so they decided to rest until the evening. None of them any longer expected to see the raft, though none confessed it. All they hoped for was to find land. They were very much cramped in the little boat, but as none grumbled about the discomforts. By and by, it occurred to Elizabeth to rig up their mackintoshes as a sort of awning, supporting it on the oars and the boat hook, and this sheltered them from the worst effects of the sun. They made another spare meal in the afternoon, and when the sun was between south and west they resumed their rowing. So far there had not been a sign of land, but Uncle Ben had certainly said that the ship had struck a reef, and where there were reefs dry lands could hardly be far away. This hope buoyed them up through the hot day. The sun went down below the horizon with the suddenness general in the southern ocean. Once more darkness was upon them. With the return of night came a sense of forlornness and desolation of spirit. They fell silent, each brooding on the sad fate which had overtaken their uncle and them. The night was cold. Enveloped in their wraps and mackintoshes, they huddled together for warmth, letting the boat drift at the mercy of the sea. Their broken sleep on the previous night and their exertions and anxieties during the day had told upon them, and after some hours the two younger girls fell asleep. Elizabeth dared not surrender herself to slumber. Who could tell what might happen? As the eldest, she felt a motherly responsibility for the others, so she had to confess to herself how utterly helpless she was if danger came. She sat with her elbows on her knees, thinking, brooding. Everything had happened so suddenly that she was only just beginning to realize the immensity of the disaster. A cockle shell of a boat that would capsize if the sea were the least bit rough, the wide ocean all around, 3 girls, healthy enough, but not inured to hardship, the possibility of drifting for days or weeks, never touching land or coming within the track of a ship, food dwindling day by day, the horrors of thirst. These dreadful images flashed in turn upon Elizabeth's mental vision and made her shudder. Why didn't we stay with Uncle? She thought, and then the remembrance of the dear old man and the happy days on board, and her conviction that the vessel had gone down before the raft could be made, smote Elizabeth's heart with grief, and for the first time the tears rolled down her cheeks unchecked. She wept till her head ached, and she felt dazed. At last, utterly worn out, she dozed into an uneasy and fitful sleep, still supporting her head on her hands. She woke every few minutes, blamed herself for not keeping a better watch, then slumbered again. She was startled into wakefulness by the rays of the early morning sun. Lifting herself stiffly and carefully, so as not to disturb the 2 girls at her feet, she looked around, and was alarmed as she caught sight of a ring of white within a few hundred yards of the starboard side of the boat. At first glance she recognized the former breakers dashing over a reef. "Girls!" she cried. "Wake up, quick!" She released herself from them, seized the sculls, and pulled energetically away from the threatened danger. Tommy threw off her mackintosh and stood up in the boat. "Land!" she cried. "Look, Mary! Beyond the breakers there's woods! Oh, I could scream for joy!" "Look out for a landing place," said Elizabeth, as she rowed slowly parallel with the reef. "What if they are savages?" murmured Mary. "Oh, we'll soon see their savage breasts," cried Tommy confidently. "I don't care if they are, so long as my feet are on dry land again. Can you see the raft?" There was no sign of a raft. Nothing was in sight but the foam-swept reef, the cliffs, and the dark background of woods behind. A pool half a mile brought the dinghy clear of the breakers, and the girls saw the sea dashing up the face of the high weather-worn cliffs. There appeared to be no beach, no possible landing place. Mary, the bookworm of the family, began to fear that the land was only one of those precipitous crags of which she had read, inaccessible from the sea. But in a few minutes they discerned to their joy a gap in the cliffs, and a sandy cove that promised an easy landing place. To this, Elizabeth turned the dinghy's head. A shark glided by as they neared the shore, but was almost unnoticed in their excitement. Tommy gave a cheer as the boat grated on the sand. In a moment she was out. Her sisters followed more deliberately. Then the 3 together, exerting all their strength, dragged the boat toilsomely up the beach. At least, they weren't totally alone when they got shipwrecked and lost on the island, unlike the actual Robinson Crusoe, who was left all alone. Loneliness is one of the hidden dangers of being a castaway. Anyway, tune in next week for the next chapters of The Girl Crusoes. Thank you for watching.